Hi, this is Dr. Gregory Sadler. I'm a professor of philosophy and the president and founder of an educational consulting company called Reason.io, where we put philosophy into practice. I've studied and taught philosophy for over 20 years, and I find that many people run into difficulties reading classic philosophical texts. Sometimes it's the way things are said or how the text is structured. But the concepts themselves are not always that complicated, and that's where I come in. To help students and lifelong learners, I've been producing longer lecture videos and posting them to YouTube. Many viewers say they find them useful. What you're currently watching is part of a new series of shorter videos, each of them focused on one core concept from an important philosophical text. I hope you find it useful as well. About halfway through Book 3 of his work on anger, Seneca is going to, over the course of several chapters, talk about a number of bad examples of people dealing with their anger, in particular those who exercise and have power. And he's going to draw on examples from Persian and Greek and Roman history, some of it fairly recent history in terms of the Romans. What is the point of this? Well, this is a common technique in not just ancient, but even in medieval and early modern writings about ethical matters, to give a number of different examples, one after the other, to try to make one key point, in this case, how bad anger is. And so we can think to ourselves, we don't want to be like those people. And we could also think to ourselves, am I like those people? Am I behaving in a way that's similar, even though I don't have the same amount of power as Caligula or Alexander the Great? Alexander not so great in this example, or any one of these Persian kings, and that could actually be quite helpful for us. So he's going to talk about how it's useful for subordinates to control this passion. And so adfectus is the word that we translate as passion here. And what is it? Rage, anger, right? And control is continentia, to exercise some self-control. But he tells us that it's even more useful, utilior, right, for people who are in charge, people who are rulers. And of course the examples that he have are all political rulers, mostly kings in this case. But we could think about CEOs, other people in the C-suite. We could think about bosses of employees in smaller groups. We could think of all sorts of examples where there's a different power dynamic. And so he is going to talk first about these barbarian kings, right? Barbaris regius Feritas. Feritas is what we're translating as savagery here, right? We get the word feral from that, sort of wildness. And so they don't control themselves well. He says many of these people have actually, unfortunately, taken anger as if it's an emblem of rule insignem regnium, right? So anger shows you that you're really the boss. You're really the person in charge, when actually you're not in charge. You can't control your anger, and you're taking it out on other people. So Darius is one example, who held Persia and a large part of the East after wresting dominion from the Magus. When he declared war on the Scyths, who were encircling the East, he was asked by Oebazus, a notable, to leave one of his three sons and then take the services of the other two. So Darius, getting angry, what does he do? He says, I'll return all three of your sons to you. Dead. So he's clearly retaliating against somebody who's making a very reasonable request. He gives the example of Xerxes. Similar situation, Pythias, the father of 5 sons, asks that one of them be released from service. Xerxes allowed him to choose the one he wanted, then had the one he picked split in 2. So a very savage way of killing him. Each half placed on one side of the road as a sacrificial victim to purify his anger. And so we read such in their anger was the savagery of barbarian kings who had not been steeped in learning and literary culture. A little bit later on, we're going to read about examples of other Persian kings, right? So he talks about the Persian king cut off an entire people's nose in Syria. The place became known as Dock Nose. Why was he doing that? He took pleasure in a new kind of punishment. Talks about Cambyses going after the Ethiopians who didn't accept slavery with gestures of grateful submission, but gave the ambassadors the sort of candid responses that kings call insulting. So Cambyses is angry and he goes after the Ethiopians. His anger is so strong that he actually ends up destroying his army through hunger and all sorts of other calamities. In the way it says, anger drove the king headlong, though he'd lost one part of his army and eaten another, until he feared he himself might be summoned by the lot. Only then did he give the signal for retreat, right? He was angry with a nation, as Seneca says, both unknown and undeserving, but at least capable of perception. Cyrus, also called Cyrus the Great, right, the Persian king, gets angry with an inanimate object, a river. When he was going to attack Babylon, which turns decisively on opportunities seized, he tried to ford the broad course of the river Gindes, and one of the white horses that drew his chariot was swept away, so the king swore he'd reduce the river that carried away his entourage, that even women would be able to tread on it while crossing. He had all of his soldiers settling down to this job, dividing the river's main bed with 180 channels, distributing it among 360 streams. So, quite an engineering feat, but not a good way to fight a war. And why did he do it? He was motivated by anger at a body of water. So, not good examples to follow, but these are barbarian kings, so maybe that's kind of their nature. Well, what about somebody who studied with Aristotle himself, Alexander of Macedon? Well, we read that Alexander was prone to anger. What did he do? He killed his dearest friend from childhood with his own hand. Why? Because Cletus was insufficiently fawning, meaning he wasn't acting in a subservient way to Alexander and didn't want to pass from freedom as a Macedonian to slavery as a Persian. So he kills his own childhood friend out of anger. Then he talks about Lysimachus, who is an equally close friend. Alexander has him thrown to the lions, and Lysimachus is actually saved. He escapes the lions, but what happens when he comes to power? He actually does very cruel things himself. When he'd done the job of pruning Telesphorus of roads all about, cutting off his ears and nose, he maintained him in a cage. And he was hungry, living in filth, and when his hands and knees, which the narrow cage forced him to use his feet, grew calloused pads, his back and sides developed sores, he was a sight no less disgusting than fearful to look at. This is the sort of things that anger will lead the Greeks to do. And then finally, Seneca is going to say, the barbarism of punitive rage, along with other vices, he talks about them as vices that have come from other nations, have now affected Roman character. Now, is this really a true story? The Romans seem to be plenty prone to anger and cruelty on their own before they saw the examples of the Persians or the Greeks or Carthaginians or whoever. The Carthaginians were legendarily cruel as well. And Seneca is going to give you some examples. So one of them is Sulla. Sulla was the dictator of Rome. Sulla and Marius were locked in a struggle. Sulla wins, and he takes it out on Marius as well as his supporters. How does he do it? Well, he has his legs broken, his eyes gouged out, his hands and tongue cut off. He tore him apart little by little and joint by joint as though he could kill him every time he wounded him. So this cruelty is sort of like anger at a higher level. And Sulla is an example of that. And he finds somebody perfectly willing to do it, Catiline, who winds up being associated with a conspiracy later on, right? And then Seneca says, well, we don't have to go to ancient history for examples. Not long ago, Gaius Caesar whipped and tortured in a single day Sextus Papius, Bertolinus Bassus, and others too, both senators and Roman knights, not while conducting an investigation, but because he felt like it. Now, Gaius Caesar, who's that? Well, we know him as Caligula, one of the worst of the Roman emperors who exercised cruelty on a very, very large scale. Cruelty is a vice that is worse than anger, but can be fostered by anger. And Caligula actually takes pleasure in it. We get a lot of different examples of this. We read that he had whipped senators. His own prior behavior made it possible to say, well, this sort of thing happens. He tortured them using all the means the world knows. The great ankle clamps, the rack, fire his own face, right? He used whips and fire on senators. So this is, lining up a lot of terrible actions. And here's a prime example of how bad Caligula was. He knew that there were countless things none would dare cast in his face, save on the point of death. So when sponges weren't at hand, he ordered the wretches' garments be torn up and the rags stuffed in their mouth. Why? So that they can't even protest against him, so they can't insult him at the end. He says, what kind of savagery is that? Let the wretch draw his last breath, give the soul away to leave the body. Don't make him send it forth through a gaping wound. Caligula goes further. He kills fathers of men he murders, right? Sending centurions around to their homes. And so Seneca is going to say, what's the point in telling you about all of this horrible stuff that goes on, these examples of leaders who give in to anger? It's not to talk so much, it's not to describe, quite literally, describere, Gaius's savagery, but the savagery, the saevitatum of anger itself, of ira, which doesn't just vent its rage, furit, on individuals, on individual people, but on nations, on cities, and even on rivers and other inanimate things that can't feel pain. So all of these furnish us with examples of how we ought not to behave if we have a little bit of power or a lot of power. And we can see that a lot of people throughout history have behaved in pretty terrible ways because of anger. So that should hopefully make us more cautious about our own liability to slip into anger and justify doing similar things to other people.